the interest and probably why a lot of us are here today in terms of the phosphorus issue was brought to the public, and most of the time, most folks weren't even concerned about phosphorus or knew anything about algae or would worry about it. 99% of the population don't really aren't affected, but that one incident brought the public's attention, and there's another one I'm going to talk a little bit about, Lake Erie, which has brought attention. And we should say we've had the good fortune, a lot of us that are speaking here, to have worked in this area a long time when this was not as sexy as it is now or as timely as it is now. We stuck with it, and that's given us a little bit of background and knowledge that has helped us to look at this big picture like we're going to talk about today. So these things do go in cycles, but the drivers are different, and I think we'll see today that one of the main drivers of why are we still talking about this is economics, and we can't really ignore that fact that economics of either recycling phosphorus or treating the waste, be it urban or agricultural, that it's based on economics. You can hear me at the back? Yes, it is. So here we go. So again, this is not rocket science, but phosphorus is a finite resource. As I mentioned earlier, we knew that it was going to run out fairly quickly. We've realized USGS had done more accounting and more looked at some of the phosphorus resources that are less feasible to, more costly to remove. And so there's more there than what we realized, but it still brought home that message that it is a finite resource and we need to be conserving what we have. It's going to run out. One of the things that people maybe not realize is that where the rock phosphate, nope, okay, sorry, maybe it's not. Where the sources are coming from, and a lot of it is, as you can see here, the great majority of the phosphorus is coming from Morocco and African nations, and so a lot more recycling that brings the idea of the importance of recycling and conserving the use of what we already have. This brings up the issue that people have talked about is some of these countries that hold the major resources of phosphorus that maintains our food supply and our food security are at a fairly politically unstable countries. And so that's something that we just can't ignore. It's in there, it's in the background, it's a backdrop to this whole idea that phosphorus is just not just a thing that we worry about in water quality. It's an essential element for crop production. We've got to remember that. What I've always said is phosphorus is not an issue, it's a resource, and it's not an issue until it gets from that soil to that water, that stream, that creek, or that lake. It is a resource. It's an essential element for optimal crop production, and this paradox we'll talk about of needing food supply, needing cheap food, and having clean water at the same time. But we do need it, and we are looking at, sorry, I got the units wrong there, but 0.2 milligrams per litre. That should be 0.2, not 0.02. But we're trying to get that in solution for an optimal, and so we add different levels of phosphorus to soil to build up fertility to have that level there that plants can remove in solution. We also know that this paradox that even though it's essential for crop production, it also produces algal growth and biological growth in waters. But the point that concerns us is it uses much less. It takes much less, 0.02 to 0.4. These are some levels that EPA set on criteria for flowing waters. Concentration is a little bit high because that water passes through plant material a bit quicker, so the residence times is much shorter. But the point is, and you'll hear it again today, unfortunately, the phosphorus that we need in the soil to make plants grow is much more than what needs in water quality. So we do not need to lose a lot of phosphorus for there to be an acceleration of algal growth. And we do need some algal growth. Fish have got to have something to eat. And so that's one of the kind of concerns. But Another point that we're going to, I think you'll hear again and again, don't feel like you're being persecuted here, because this is not a Chesapeake Bay issue. This is I have to say, it is a global issue. It is occurring in other countries. China, you'll see a lot of concerns and some things from other people today about China. But the Baltic Sea, there are many other areas now that we know eutrophication, dead zones, is a concern, a major concern. In a lot of cases, it's phosphorus and nitrogen. It flip-flops. There's a debate, is it nitrogen, is it phosphorus? I think we need to move past that. Yes, maybe there is one at one time of the year and one at the other time, but we do need to manage both as sustainably as possible. But it is a global issue. It's not just something that's affecting Chesapeake Bay. So I was going to talk a little bit about what we've learned and what we've done in different watersheds and how that reflects or relates to what is happening here. Some of the lessons we might learn, or some of the things, oh, well, we shouldn't have done that. But and one is Lake Erie, which has been an excellent example of what can happen. And also in one of the litigated watersheds where I am now in the Illinois River, where waters, and it's the same here, waters pass state line, and once it passes the state line, different water quality criteria enact, and so upstream users are responsible for downstream water. And in this case, it's been litigated. And I want to just talk a little bit about what some of the outcomes of that are. And they're surprising to a certain extent. And then finally, wrap up with a little bit about, well, what can we do? Well, what's the, how we've been talking about this for a long time. How did we be missing the message? Is it the researchers not getting that message out there properly? And more about outreach of that work. Fact sheets, field days to a certain extent are okay, but they just don't cut it to make that real change that we would hope for. So the processes of phosphorus loss, just this was kind of 101. Phosphorus loss really was always thought of by the traditionalists as a surface process, that if you got rain and it was great, it was raining harder than what the water could infiltrate into the soil, you got runoff. So you have infiltration excess. Sometimes we have places where the soil gets so wet, it can't take more water, and you get what we call saturation excess runoff. But basically, we all thought it was a surface process, and predominantly it still is that way. And so we then see a lot of, if you've got surface runoff, you've got erosion. That's a major source of phosphorus, because as we'll see, phosphorus binds to soil, which is it's a resource in a way. It's money in the bank to a farmer because it's in there in the soil, but it becomes unavailable with time. But if it attached to sediment and you get erosion, you're going to get phosphorus moving with that soil. But what we've also seen, and a bit more detail, is that as that soil becomes more enriched in phosphorus, that sponge gets more saturated, it gets leakier. And so as we see runoff occurring from soils with higher levels of phosphorus in it, we get more phosphorus in solution. And it's that solution phosphorus that causes the biggest short-term response in a water body. The algae, like plants and crops, they can take up soluble phosphorus, and so that's what they see first. So that's what we, in the short term, are concerned about. But in terms of what's going on and what's coming off, about 5% generally, sometimes it's less, sometimes it's more in an extreme wet year, but about 5% of what we put on might come off. That's not an economic concern to a farmer, and that's part of the problem of why should I pay to have to do something that's going to affect my bottom line when it's such a small amount. We see about 35% coming in, that's immobilized in the soil. It's a residual pool. Some states do account for residual phosphorus, this legacy phosphorus in the soil for the next year's crop. A lot of states don't. But we see about 60% of that going off. These are just general numbers. Josh is going to talk a little more specific with Maryland later on, Josh McGrath. But those are numbers you can see. There's a buildup in the soil. It's there, and we have these soil testing approaches, which either are maintenance approaches or what we call sufficiency. You just put on what the next crop needs, or you build the soil up. And with manures, we are usually adding, and we did this was recommended practice, and extension were following the best science that they had at the time to use manures based on nitrogen. And then in many cases, you're putting on 3 to 4 times more phosphorus than what you're doing. You're building the soil phosphorus up. Well, that was there for a bank that the farmer could use as, for the next crop. But doing that year after year, that's the situation we see now where I am in Arkansas, Georgia, North Carolina, and also here on the eastern shores. This level builds up. And so we did some water quality work, some runoff work. We had a network of scientists working around the 2000 started. It was really a knockoff of the Fisteria. The funding was put out there. EPA gave some funding, gave some resources for some scientists, and one of them, Pete Kleiman, was part of that initially, and that's how we got into this whole scientific arena. But it was a opportunity we had, and we were looking at phosphorus losses in soil. And so we will use the rainfall simulation, small plots, don't want to go into detail, but we looked at, if you've got an increase in phosphorus level in the soil, you get this relationship. It's sometimes it's a little bit dirtier. Here we've got a rainfall simulator which uses the same rainfall rate, so you've got just the one variable there, soil phosphorus. But what happens is you get an increase, and it's what we'd expect. Again, it's not rocket science, but it's a curvilinear, which means that as you get more phosphorus in the soil, it tends to come out into runoff more easily. And so you get this higher risk as you go upwards. Here, this is where we get crop response, and this is our Malic. It's the same test you use. You've got a fertilized FIV score here, but this is a soil test, a general method we use. Crop response, and it's low. Now you see a lot of soils there about crop response. Again, that's going back to this idea. That's what we were telling farmers to do. I mean, it was what we were recommending. Use that nitrogen and that manure to build it up. And these are soils that they had been using and using that practice on. So it wasn't bad management. This wasn't something that it was just disrespectful or something that farmers were doing. They were following what the recommended practices were at that date. But this is the situation we have. And then when we start to add phosphorus to it, with either in manures, fertilizers, mineral, it's all the same. When it gets out there to a large extent, it doesn't fall on that line. And so the point here that we tried to make back in 2000, and Frank Cole's going to talk a little bit more detail about it towards the end, is this idea that when Maryland or somebody else wanted to say there's enough phosphorus in the soil, that's it. To a certain extent, that's true, but if you're looking at actually the risk of phosphorus loss, there's other things that go on, and one of them is how much you apply that year, and the other is hydrology. As I mentioned before, phosphorus isn't an issue if it's in that field, and when we get runoff, that's this black box, and what we can look at phosphorus in the soil, and we can do our cause-effect runoff plot studies, but when it rains or water moves, you can't see it, and it just turns basically everything on its head. I worked with a guy called Bill Geberg, who was a hydrologist, and he always said, you just got to get out there when it rains. We do a lot of research and spend a lot of time in the lab, but we've got to get out there when it's raining, watch what happens, because what happens in the field probably isn't what you expect to happen from your ideas and your preconceptions. The farmers know this because they're out there every day. But this idea of hydrology turns everything on its head. And so there's this idea that what we did then was look at, you have to have a source of phosphorus, which is either soil phosphorus that's built up over time, or you've added phosphorus to the soil, but you've got to have this transport mechanism. And that's the idea of some of these risk tools that we're not going to talk about today, but we can just provide the science to how they came about. They are very similar from state to state. There's a common standard that NRCS have developed, and they're still working on refining, that every state follows to a certain extent the same guidelines on how you manage this risk. And the premise behind all of this is you've got to have a source and you've got to have a transport. And with easy ways that you'll look at that transport risk, be it surface runoff, be it leaching, that where these two coincide, you have this idea of this critical source area, and this kind of changed to a certain extent. EPA's targeting approach, targeting conservation. We now hear about precision conservation. We've had precision agriculture, we're moving to precision conservation now. And the idea is, if you can find and target that yellow spot, you're ahead of the game. And the work that we did in Pennsylvania, at some of our very heavily monitored watersheds, instrumented, shows that about 80% of the phosphorus coming out of the watershed comes from about 20% of that land area. Now, that land area changes from watershed to watershed. It's not always the same. It could be near the creek, it could be further away from the creek. But the general principle is that a lot of the phosphorus is coming from a small area and a few large storms. If we can target those, we're ahead of the game. We did a lot of work back in the 60s, 70s, broad BMPs, conservation measures across the landscape. They weren't that successful in that they weren't targeted to the proper source. So what can we do? We have these conservation measures. I'll go briefly because Josh is going to talk a little bit more about them, but I'd like to split them up into farm gate measures where that's more of a balanced approach. That's probably one of the solutions, and the other measures where we try to are what we call band-aids. They're really a temporary fix, but trying to get this system into balance. And we've got phytase, we've got dietary, we're trying to match the feed requirements of phosphorus in the animals. So the more you feed that phosphorus, the more it's going to poop out at the end, the more land you need. So you don't overfeed, you don't want to over-fertilize soils, you don't want to overfeed animals with phosphorus either. Additives, where there's a lot of work going on adding things to manure. Alum, that's ammonia, but it also binds phosphorus in chicken houses. But treating manures, recovering that phosphorus from soil. A lot of work, a lot of ideas, a lot of technology, none of it, I wouldn't say that, a lot of it doesn't get translated to the farmers at the moment because it's too darned expensive for a farmer to do. Maybe as a cooperative, possibly, but it's not cost effective at the moment. But as fertilizer prices go up or energy prices increase, then some of these resources these methods of manure separation and recovery of phosphorus will occur. They're occurring more in Europe because the costs, benefits from doing that are much greater. And so we do see struvite being removed. So then we get on to, okay, once you're on the farm, manage the source. And there's this idea, you'll hear again and again, you probably already heard it, the 4R approach, the right place, the right rate, and the right method, and the right putting in the soil in the right way. So there's this 4R approach to common sense utilization of that resource of phosphorus. Don't you need to put on more than what you need for that crop? It's a waste of the resource. And the other one is looking at injection. And when you get runoff, if you inject that phosphorus into the soil, it's away from that zone of runoff and interaction with water, so you get less coming off in the runoff. And so subsurface injection, getting it below the ground, if you've got a lot of leaching, which obviously you do in some areas here, and the water tables are high, then that has another complexity. Getting it in the ground isn't going to help you a whole lot if your water table is very high. Transport measures. That's the idea that if you can stop that runoff, that idea that we're going to stop it from moving from that field, and it's cover crops. I think that's a very popular one in Maryland. A lot of work done here promoting that idea, putting cover crops to capture that phosphorus or to cover the soil during the bare fallow part of the year, so you don't get runoff, you don't get erosion. Part of the trick with cover crops, if that crop is there, it decays, or you kill it and it's got phosphorus in it, and it could be released. So again, a lot of these things, they sound good, but there's a catch, and it's managing that cover crop to minimize any down system release of phosphorus later on. Conservation tillage, again, is one of the greatest success stories of NRCS and soil conservation. It reduced erosion dramatically, and we'll see a little bit later that it has some trade-offs. They all do. There isn't this silver bullet. And then the last one, the edge of field buffers, trap it, which again is a good conservation measure. It's very common, popular, but there's this paradox that you are trapping that phosphorus. Eventually, it's not an infinite sink. It could become a source of phosphorus down the road. So you've got to be aware of that. You've got to manage some of these buffers that can't just keep on trapping phosphorus indefinitely. And so go on to some ideas of this conservation paradox. The idea that we need soils, we need food, we need cheap food. Tile drainage increases soil productivity. Some soils you can't crop without draining it. But what has happened is when you get a large amount of tile drainage, you do get, that field's now connected to that stream because you've got a drain, you've got a pipe going straight into it. So you're bypassing to a large extent that soil matrix that could have bound up phosphorus. So you've got to recognize when you put tile drains in, you are increasing that connectivity of that field to that stream. Soil health, PFAS transport again. Soil health is a great thing. It helps the soil retain water. It helps in many, many different ways. But if you look at no-till, it can, unless you adapt the nutrient management, you're going to get a surface buildup of phosphorus at the soil. And so, you know, no-till in and of itself is good. But again, you've got to manage those nutrients a little different than you did if you were doing conventional tillage. It makes sense. You do get the no-till, some macropores, obviously you want those, but they do provide conduits for water to move through. And so there are pathways there for phosphorus and nutrient movement. But the point here is we do have these measures, but there is a downside, a trade-off that we see, and nutrient management should adapt as we implement those conservation measures, and not just assume we've got a cover crop, solve the problem, it's gone away. So I would like to just talk about a little bit about this Lake Erie issue. It was a case example of a lot of different things, an example of all the different factors at play, the complexity of the situation. In the 70s, they did a lot of work putting money in and helping farmers manage nutrients, because these two watersheds were dominantly ag watersheds. There's very little urban development in those watersheds. And so the nutrient management advice, soil testing, reduced fertilizer and manure applications about 20-30% overall. And what you can see here, this is the fertilizer application per year. This is an annual amount that was, these are from sales figures. But you can see that over time there's been this decrease. So that was because extension and because advisors were recommending less fertilizers, but farmers were listening and they were doing that. And what you saw was this dramatic decrease over time, these watersheds of phosphorus going into Lake Erie. The other thing that now obviously you've heard about is that the soil phosphorus, the dissolved phosphorus in that water started to increase. And I mentioned earlier that dissolved phosphorus is what the algae see straight away. That's what they just thrive off of. But now what we're seeing is back in the 80s where it was about 20% of the phosphorus coming off, now it's maybe 80% of the phosphorus coming off. So that impact of that phosphorus is greater on the lake. And so now we're seeing record levels of phosphorus, record levels of blooms. We have the Toledo incident where the cyanobacteria came back into the water drinking supply and the water was cut off. Again, that's a good example of bringing phosphorus back to the public's attention and saying, what are we doing about it? Well, we've been doing a lot about it over the years. But again, it just gets us this situation here where these drivers are complex. It's not an easy solution. We just can't just go out with conservation measures. There's a range of factors in here, some which we can control, some which we can't. One of them is there was a slight change in distribution of rainfall over time. We've heard about climate fluctuations. Well, obviously it happens, but the annual rainfall hadn't changed that much. But when it occurred, there was more intense rains in the spring, which are times when farmers have to do what they were doing on the field. It's a bit more vulnerable to nutrient loss. So there was a slight shift in this area in the potential of that transport factor I told you about. There was some build-up in those soils because they went from no non-tillage to almost 100% tillage, no-till. When John Deere came out with a trusted planter, everybody, most of the people went to that way. So you had a dramatic change in the management, and you do see a buildup of phosphorus in the soil at the surface, and if you get runoff, then it can release or take out more of that soluble phosphorus. More recently, with fuel mandates, you've got an increase in phosphorus coming off from tile drains because of increased areas of corn. And so, the researchers said, well, you just put fall application, just stop putting it out in the fall. Very few other practice cover crops. Well, when you get that to the farmers will say, well, look, I've got so much going on in the spring. I've got to get it out in the fall by fertilizer because I know I can get it there. If I wait, I may not be able to do it, and I'm putting my bottom line at risk. And so the point here was that we need to get some of these, the research and what we're implementing has to consider the farmers, and what they do on a daily basis is managed by the decisions they make on a farm level, and that sometimes our research and our advice doesn't connect and doesn't acknowledge or recognize that. So then moving on, I'd like to talk a little about the Illinois River, which is in Arkansas. Water moves from Arkansas into Oklahoma. Oklahoma set a standard of 0.037, requiring Arkansas to meet that. There is a thriving poultry industry. It's the second in the country to Georgia. 2 billion chickens a year produced there. And there's also been Walmart and other companies have headquartered there that have increased population. So it's, again, very similar to here. You've got a large population increase and you've got agriculture that is thriving, all contributing to that phosphorus pool. But what happened here, the scientists couldn't agree. From Oklahoma and Arkansas, they couldn't agree on what tool to use. So the judge stepped in, the lawyer stepped in. In one case, Oklahoma sued Arkansas for different reasons, but to basically protect their water resources out of the city of Tulsa, or Recreation Lakes in Tahlequah sued the poultry companies and a couple of municipalities. So, because the scientists couldn't agree, the judge said, for 300 parts per million of phosphorus is all, you can't put any more phosphorus on anymore. You've got to move out at least a third of the poultry litter that you're producing. It's got to go out that watershed. And over time, we had a tool, that risk tool, and now we've seen over time that levels have dropped by about a third. They've gone from about 3 tons per acre. The average now at 1.3 tons per acre of litter application. These are pastures, so there's a lot more flexibility to these farmers, but they adapted. There was doom and gloom at the time, but farming did adapt to some of these requirements. But these requirements weren't voluntary. They were forced on them. Everybody that wanted to apply phosphorus to a soil had to have a nutrient management plan. And it was documented. There were checks and balances by the state. Each state had their own team. In 2014, you set a standard. Well, the judge thought, well, if 300 is good, a little bit less is better. And so what we've seen now is that this last year, over 85% of the litter that was produced in the first watershed that was litigated, Uchi-Spavinaw, is out of that watershed, and now almost half of what's in the Illinois, which is much bigger, goes to Missouri, Oklahoma, Kansas, to row crop country. So the majority of the litter that's produced in these watersheds now exported. Again, it's a little different situation here, but it did work. It does work. A system is set up that puts the buyers and the sellers and the haulers into the system together, and it can work. But like I say, you've got a threshold. You can reduce it. Now the judge, part of the settlement agreement or the finality of it, they've reduced that number to 150. But the point is, the scientists couldn't agree. The lawyers got involved, and the legal system got involved. And unfortunately, that's when we started to have less and less activity in a certain extent. We hope that example, you don't get to that stage because it stops dialogue, and it starts this finger pointing, which is going on, obviously, in a lot of different places. So one of the downside, the trade-offs to that was that manure is going out, that nitrogen's gone, farmers have got to go buy it. So there's a loss of forage production, and some farmers will tell you, maybe it's the weather, drought, but that they have decreased herd sizes. The beef producers were the ones that were benefiting from the litter. Those that were producing litter had very small land holdings, some of them, and they could export it. They were never going to land use it anyway. So it was a resource that was gone that's now got to be paid for by some other source. And so they have seen some reduction in herd numbers because of the forage is not as productive in some cases before. So what has that had an impact on water quality? Over time, yes, 10 years, 14, 15 years, we've seen a third in Illinois. It's not gone down to the 037. That 037 is basically a pristine. It's not going to get down to 037 on an annual basis. It might at certain times of the year, but basically it's not going to do that. So we do see over the time of these processes, we will get there. You do get there, but it takes time. And part of this time is this idea of this legacy, that there's things in the watershed that we've done for 20, 30 years that are now providing a slow source. And how do you tease out what's there from a legacy as to what is there from what you're doing today, and what measures, conservation measures you're doing now are contributing on what's coming from what's there in this legacy. But soil phosphorus builds up much quicker than you can decrease it. Wetlands trap and buffers trap, but it's this paradox that they can then release phosphorus to water. BMPs take time sometimes to be efficient. You can't just put a buffer in and it's got to grow. It takes time. And then you have these hydrology, groundwater movements, slow. And you've got uptake and release of phosphorus in sediments that's slowly releasing P from either the sediments in the river or the sediments in the bay or the watershed. But sometimes adoption is different by different farmers. Some farmers will, some farmers don't see it the same way. But we have provided a lot of cost share programs to help farmers adopt these practices. So what next? This idea we need to develop some partnerships. We need to transfer the science. Again, we've been here a long time. We have a lot of research. We've been doing research on this for a long, long time. And maybe we as scientists have not done as good a job as we should at transferring it. We need to recover, recycle, and reuse that phosphorus that's in the waste. There's a lot of phosphorus in food waste, urban waste, that's not being recycled. Managing expectations, these ideas that these elephants that we have, we can't expect cheap food and clean water at the same time. You can't have both. We've grown to expect it. One of the things that we've developed is working with farmers in Arkansas. A couple of other states have done it. Started off in Wisconsin. Is working with real farmers, using them as a mouthpiece as well as extension to peer pressure to other farmers, looking at on-farm demonstrations, strip plots, small test plots, addressing local issues of water quality, not something that's halfway down the country in the Gulf of Mexico that's not important to a local farmer. But the main part of this type of a program was farmer empowerment, getting them in part of this process. With this legal process, and I've had to stand up in front of farmers, and a part of it, they feel like they've got left behind in the decision-making process. The lawyers sat in the room, came up with all these decisions, 300 soil tests, and the farmers then would just get the news after the fact. They were never involved in that discussion. But part of this was getting them empowered in the process that they are good stewards and that they're part of the solution. So we have this idea that people do expect blue waters, and they do expect to go to the supermarket, get cheap chicken, cheap steaks. And, this increase is going to increase. It's not going to go away because the pressures to produce and feed more people is going to increase. And so this idea, this elephant, this Indian parable, if we had 7 blindfolded scientists in a room, they all have a different idea of what that thing is. Everybody in this room probably has a different idea about this topic. And it relates well to this idea of water quality. I want a green lawn. I want my lawn greener than the neighbors. So I'm going to put out a little bit of extra fertilizer. It's manure. No, it's not. It's fertilizer. I want more trees. So there's this idea that we all view things differently, and this is very important, getting our message across. And so, in summary, this idea is this is not a Bay issue. This is an issue that's facing more and more watersheds within the US and across the world. It's not something that's related. So there are examples that can be taken from other places. Look towards more targeted conservation. We've got to manage for P&N. We're talking about phosphorus. We talked about nitrogen years ago. We've got to talk about phosphorus and nitrogen. We've got to look at these legacy, what's happened years ago, how that's affecting what we see in management now. looking to work more with outreach to farmers and farm consultants. We did some work, we were doing surveys. Where do farmers go? They don't go to the researcher for information. They go to the ag consultant, the one that they've used for years and years and generations. Those are the ones they go to. We as researchers have got to connect with those people. We've got to get our message across to those people as well as that farmers are actually going to for their day-to-day management decisions. Small plot testing, cost beneficial manure products. As costs increase, we're going to get more products. But again, this whole goes back to this idea that we were here a long time ago. This isn't going to go away. We have discussed phosphorus, but we've done a lot of research. There's a lot of research out there that we can apply, but it's not going to go away. And this idea that there's a sleeping giant out there that, whether it be a regulatory agency or whatever, that is going to be awakened eventually if we don't start to do something that shows these effects and document this, that we're going to be here talking about it in another 10 years. So I think I've run out of time a bit ago, so I will close and thank you.